Now, before the panel begins taking questions, we'd like to hear briefly from Denise and Connie. So Denise and Connie, would you first just tell us a little bit about your current work, and then maybe you could give us a few reflections that you've had so far about our morning speakers.
I'll go quickly. I think I'm the oldest one here, so. But let me first real quickly give you a history. I think it's kind of important to know. In the 70s, when my daughter Julie was born with Down syndrome, we did have a program here at our church, but it was, at the time, everyone who had a disability was in a room kind of never seen and wasn't part of anything. That was what it was like then. After Julie was born, and she didn't always want to go to that room because there were people with disabilities that were adults with physical disabilities in a wheelchair, and then there were people with cognitive, and she wanted to be part of the body of the church. And so when I was in a Bible study with one of our pastors in the late 80s, I explained how philosophy had changed over the years so greatly in the schools. Now kids with disabilities were being included, and that needed to be happening here at our church. And I can't go into all of the details, but when the church decided that, yes, we need to make a philosophy change, and we started looking for someone to be a part-time person in charge of disabilities ministry at the church, and guess what? We couldn't find anybody. There was a pastor who was close to retirement that they looked at hiring, and he decided at the end, you know what, I don't have any disability training, this isn't for me. And then there was a young man in his 20s with cerebral palsy that at the end decided, no, this isn't what I wanted. And so I can remember after a 2-year search on the committee being asked if I would consider leading up this ministry. There was nothing. It warms my heart to see all of you here today, because at that time, in the 90s, I was on the Christian Council on Persons with Disabilities with Johnny Erickson, taught it, and schools, you couldn't find a Christian school that was ever addressing disabilities ministry. And so to see Biola and what they've done over the years is remarkable and is exciting to us. But when we were talking about starting a ministry, we sat down with everyone and we said, you know what, you're the junior high pastor, you are the pastor of counseling. This isn't going to be a segregated program. If you are counseling someone, if someone comes to me from having an amniocentesis that they're thinking of having an abortion, then our counseling pastor better be right there with us to be sure this family understands that they're part of our family, and they are going to have this baby, and we're all going to be there too. But so it's an inclusive ministry. And when I started, our philosophy was to work with any way we could to identify and break down barriers that keep people with disabilities and their families from being the integral part of the body of our church. And so that's where we've come from. I know I'm supposed to take just a couple minutes. So a couple stories came to mind as I listened this morning. I think of one of our first families that came to us with Jordy. Jordy was 4 years old. Jordy was at a 2-month-old level. She was never going to speak. They didn't feel she would never walk. But they couldn't go to church because they couldn't bring her to a nursery because she was too big. They didn't want to bring her into the worship center because she made loud noises and would distract people. What could they do? And so she was one of my first students that came to me, a family, and at that time I was really militant. Any child with a disability would be in a regular Sunday school class, no matter what it took. And I can remember going into the 3-year-old class and talking to the kids, and I've learned awareness is so important. And I said to those little 3-year-olds, this is Jordy, she wants to be part of your group. And she has her buddy, her aide, who's going to be with her. She can't talk. She is blind. And explained, and I'll never forget the little 3-year-old, when I was done, went up to her and waved at her timidly. And so then we talked, do you remember what it means to be blind? Close your eyes and then he just got it and he just shouted at the top of his voice, Jordy, welcome. And that's at his level. As she grew, when she was in the kindergarten class. It was the staff in there that it was hardest to get them to understand why she should be there. But she doesn't understand, and for them to watch the other kids after 3 years of being with Jordy, arguing over who would push her out to the playground in her little wheelchair-type stroller, and to see that the value her life had, not only for her being in there to see Jesus through them, but for how it made a difference to the kids. But that's just an example. To fast forward to today, what we have going on here at our church. We have our brochure. I'm just going to go through it. On Sunday morning, we have an adult class for our Fellowship of Friends that is just a community group. They've chosen to be in this group because they want to share life together. They all have cognitive disabilities. There's about 35 to 40 in there. But they also want to be in the worship center, participating in communion, being part of the body, being baptized. They are not in the back room. They are accepted. We also have classes, 3 different levels for kids, primarily with autism. We have lots of families coming from a distance because we have a place for their child. But we have a group that comes in to our main room. They get checked in. Half of them, because of their abilities, go with a buddy, a junior high school buddy, down to regular children's programming. The others, because of their disabilities, their behaviors or whatever, they stay for a small class together. And then another hour we have a group of teenagers that are very severely, with severe behaviors that we have a place for them. And I thought of one of them when Stephanie mentioned Joy in ministry, and her name is Joy. She has tough behaviors, and we do a Christmas program every year, and I was wondering if all of the students would want to participate. And she got up, her parents, it means everything to have her up on front of the worship center doing her part, and you're holding her to keep her from barreling off the stage, and she does one little part. But not only does it minister to her, but to everyone else and to her parents, that their child has this opportunity. So we have the Sunday morning programs. We have a program in the summer, a week, a camp, kind of like a VBS, where we have a child with a disability from 5 until high school age with a buddy peer their same age that we found in the church, and then a junior higher, that partner, and then they go through a morning and afternoon of rotations from worship, Bible, music, rec, crafts. But that's probably been the most valuable program that we have, to have everyone in the church become, and the kids especially, become familiar with the uniqueness and the value of all people with disabilities. So I could go on for a long time, but I know I'm not supposed to. But we just have found the uniqueness in every person, regardless of their abilities or their disabilities. And as Johnny once said when she was speaking here, a person with disabilities does more for the spiritual well-being of your church than you can ever imagine. And we've found that to be true.
Thank you. I'm just pleased to be here this morning with such an esteemed panel. First of all, I just wanted to preface, I feel I need to preface my background before I say what I'm going to say. I have over 30 years of experience in providing accommodations to students with disabilities, various disabilities, all the disability categories, as well as my education. My doctorate, I have an emphasis, it's in education, but an emphasis in disability studies. And it is the emphasis in disability studies that leads me to the concerns and how I vision disability ministries in the church. Before I forget, on your tables, I did print out an article on person first language that I would like everyone to take, and to feel free to use that, because I think as I think about what we've talked about today, we need to really be reflective in, one, the language we use, and Brian talked a little bit about language and how we address people. and individuals who are different and how we see different. And that difference, do we see difference as a deficit, or is it just different? And so when we think about disability ministries, and when I see disabilities ministry, or I vision disabilities ministry, I vision unity. I vision a place where individuals will see strength in unity and not difference, as Connie has shared. Also, when we think about our personal aspect and where we see, let me backtrack. When we begin to think about our role in providing services in the church, I think we have to think about reflection and being mindful in our reflection. And I've been doing a lot of reading. I was sharing with John regarding the recent readings I've been doing on mindful reflection. And I think as Christians, when we think about difference, we have to begin to think about how we think about difference. And as Christians, sometimes I think it might be difficult for us because we may perceive that we're okay and we don't have any biases. And I think sometimes we have to begin to think about, do I have any biases? Do I see difference? And really begin to be honest. And I think to begin with any type of ministry in this sense, we have to look at ourselves. And we have to be honest and say, do I have biases? And then address those biases. I'm reading work by Dre and Wineski right now, and they have a 6 steps process by which we do mindful reflection in terms of how we see difference to become culturally responsive. And so cultural just doesn't mean race and ethnicity. It also includes issues related to disabilities. And so I'm excited to be here. I'm looking forward to our discussion today and being a part. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Several of you have emphasized the uniqueness of every particular situation. So maybe it's not fair to start with a kind of general question, but here goes anyway. Looking at the disability ministries that are available here at E-Free Fullerton can be quite overwhelming. How do you start? That is, how does a local congregation that is perhaps welcoming its first family with disabilities, what's a first step for them? How do they ease into this? What can they do with what's at hand?
Well, when I started, I realized it takes time. And usually, like Stephanie mentioned, I think it's a parent that comes to the church because they need a place for their child. And that's great, but over time, I hope the parents can be in worship or they can be part of the body without being in charge. But what I have found is you find one person in your child, you find Adam or someone in your church that has a special need, and you figure out how you can help him to be part of the church body. And that's so, if that's what you have, if you have a child or if you have an adult, you start there and you slowly, I don't think you put a sign up that says disability ministry offered here until you've kind of started at the ground level and met the needs of a certain individual, and God will bring the people to you. Mm-hmm. And one thing, you do not have to, I had no training. I tell my volunteers, you have to have just the love for Jesus and for these individuals, and you will go.
Mm-hmm.
At the most practical level, when someone comes through the door, ask, how can we make this more comfortable for you? Mm-hmm. And I think if that there's a tendency to just be threatened by the awkwardness of some situations, and just being willing to say, can we make this work for you, and see what they say. And I think that's the question that very rarely gets asked, just because we're just nervous to ask it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also think that we have to consider the issue of binaries, and if we create binaries in our church, and the us and the them. And I think that's a good place for churches to begin. Is it a culture there that's is it cultivated where individuals feel like they're a part of? Or are there already binaries within that environment?
How would you advise people to help those with disabilities become ministers, not merely, as several mentioned, sort of recipients of care and ministry, but those who are themselves making their own spiritual contribution? What are some ways that you could advise us in that regard?
I think it is really important that people with disabilities get to use their gifts, whatever it might be. Every single one of us has spiritual gifts, whether it be they're handing out bulletins, whether they get to have a part in a responsive reading on Sunday morning, but people with disabilities need to be seen, and I think starting at the same time you're starting maybe trying to start a program, you need to also have awareness going on with in your church with your leadership, and that people, I think of a story with a young man who came to our church when the mother calls and said, I heard you had a disability ministry, and our son got turned away from the Catholics and from the Mormons. He likes to worship. Can he come to your church? I thought, oh my, what are we getting? When I met the mother, I found out that she had never married and very much had a cognitive delay herself, could hardly keep. But this young man with autism probably had a little Tourette's in there, and his language could be colorful, and that was the only language you could understand from him. But I will never forget, Mom didn't want to sit with him in the worship center. My husband sat on one side and another man on the other side, and frankly, you had to watch where he put his hands. He was low, and I will never forget, he would verbally outcry, but yeah, when the music came on, he was worshiping in his own way. And when someone from the worship band came down after several weeks and said to my husband, is this your son? No, he's one of my friends. No. And wow, I've been observing him over the weeks, and he's caused me to worship in a new way. And by having him in there, and yeah, it wasn't real easy. And I can remember he would say the S worded, and my husband would go, yes, it's a nice shirt I have on, isn't it? A nice shirt, But just to model for others is huge, I think.
I think what kind of your example of your husband covering is really, isn't that what Christ is about when we, when we cover the faults of others, we forbear the ills of others, and so that's a great example.
Do you have some advice for us on how to, so in that example, there were two tall grown men standing on either side of an occasionally disruptive worshiper. But when there are questions of outbursts of emotion or of violence or of, how do you handle that? How do you both minister to the person who may be doing that, as well as helping those around? How do you help with those sorts of scenarios?
Well, I think it might be a mistake to begin with the assumption of disruption. It may be that what we need to do is to learn just to look at one another properly and to take seriously the essence of the gospel, which is how you love your neighbour. Certainly some people may be disruptive, but the majority of people are just going to be there. And the temptation is always to go to the extremes and say, well, what if this happens, what if that happens, when we haven't actually got a basis. So if you have a community within which people genuinely love one another and learn to look at one another properly, i.e. not just looking at disabilities, but looking at one another as people, then you have the foundation that's necessary to deal with disruption. So if you're beginning with disruption, then it's like I think Jesus once talked something about building castles in sands and things. You're starting in the wrong place. Yeah.
And often disruption is a sign of anxiety of some variety. So At one church, we know a woman who had cerebral palsy and was, in a wheelchair would make a lot of noise, and they finally figured out that sitting still made her uncomfortable, and so somebody just pushed her wheelchair up and down during the whole service, and she was totally quiet and enjoyed it. And it was a buddy who then, had a totally different experience of what's going on in worship. So I think getting past that first moment always opens up into new regularities. And I think part of the answer to your first question is don't be put off by the first moment, because all of us are uncomfortable at the beginning. And if the rule is let's sort of keep it quiet and ordered, and we're not going to let anybody sort of cross the threshold who can't do that, then that's a very deadening place to be. So another way, the alternative way to put John's point is that some of us can suppress our feeling of discomfort when we come into a new place, and some of us can't. And those who can't probably will also not suppress their joy later on. And if we can get past the distress, we'll get the joy later.
If I could, sorry, I want to pick up on a point that's actually John's that I was hoping you might say, that I just heard this week about, I think there's sometimes this, we have this feeling, this need to create a program or some picture. We're either going to have an inclusion model, or we're going to have a model where they go off into their appropriate teaching zones, or we're going, but we want to find some fit, and really that's impossible. We all have to kind of shift and adapt. And John made this great point. You'll say it, you would say it better than me, but about,
Of course.
Sometimes, if there's disruption, if there's a situation that is difficult to deal with, sometimes it's appropriate to allow that person to be in a space that's more comfortable, that's more suited to them, but that we are careful, we are not abandoning them. So John had this great point about sometimes there's separation, sometimes that's okay. We don't abandon, we don't forget people. And I'm really aware, when I hear people talk about things, sometimes I have this visceral reaction. And this woman who was describing having met this week as well, that she described having a ministry with children with special needs for the last 25 years. And it was only in the last 3 years that they actually brought the children into the church to be with other people. And I just thought, are you kidding me? But I didn't say that, of course. But, that, for me, that raises like, wow, was that not asked for before? Was that not a need? Like, it's inclusion is more than just, you can be here, you can be in this room with us. It's we need you. We need you to be part and inform our lives, So anyway, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I also think that we need to there's two things. Rethink our understanding of what worship and holiness is in some senses. We just came from the Johnny and Friends conference, so you could turn the volume up in your worship so loud that you can't hear yourself sing, so therefore people can do anything they want. So that'd be one solution. But another solution, well, if you think about it, Jesus is born in a stable, surrounded by shepherds out and the angels singing, cattle doing the thing. So the holiest moment in history is full of raucousness. When Jesus is preaching, I'm sure people weren't sitting there, good point, preacher. They'd have been shouting, they'd have been doing all sorts of things. So disruption is always part of kind of the way we are. And sometimes we view disruption in an unrealistic way, or at least we see it as something that's not part of what we are, but I think it probably is. I've forgotten the second point, but it'll come back to me in a second.
Steph, your comment about this lady who'd been leading a disability ministry kind of leads into another of these questions. How do you help people who are perhaps eager to be involved in ministry to the disabled, but who themselves are either communicating to the disabled that they're not part of the church or that they're sort of second class? So those who are, helpful, wanting to be helpful and involved, but themselves are not being perhaps as helpful as they might? How do you not squelch their enthusiasm or spurn their desire to minister, but how do you gently correct them? And that's not just for you, but for all the panel.
I think that's probably one of the most difficult parts of the whole equation in our experience.
Yeah.
But Connie probably has found some solutions.
I think you have to be patient, but I think that is why all along you need to be doing, through example and just awareness training to even those that are helping, that how wonderful to come to something like this, to listen to John, to listen about the value, and each person has something to offer. And I think I've found with my volunteers, ask anything you want, say anything you want. We're here to work together, to learn together. It's okay if you don't understand something. I'd rather you be open and honest and say, are you feeling fearful or whatever, and let's move on and keep, I think the more that they are together and watch you being, hey, it's okay, accepting of whatever the person is doing goes a long way. You can't force people to be comfortable, but you can work at easing them into it too. We've had some of our younger volunteers maybe go to the home of the child with a disability that they're one-on-one with, to kind of get to know, when you get to know the siblings, the family and everything, you understand maybe even more on what they're going through.
I think that idea of modeling is really essential, isn't it? And you know, it's very easy to just pretend like we know people because we spend an hour with them on a Sunday. But actually, how much do any of us know anyone else that we meet on a Sunday? And you know, I think what I would add is teaching is always vital, and people don't know how to do this. I meet so many people who don't even know how to do children's ministry. They've never been trained in it, and they've been in it for umpteen years and feeling unconfident. So it's great to ask for help and support in that, and if people don't ask, just to assume they want to ask. But also in my work too, with Welcoming Church Forum, I really seek out pastors, and I seek out the people who are there with their children and people who are working with the children, and try to bring them together, because I think that it can't, it has to be modeled from the top down as well as lived from the bottom up, and both kind of somewhere meeting in that middle is the space where we really are empowered.
And I'd like to, as she said, modeled from the top. And I can remember before I started, I started in 92, I think it was in 90, I was at a conference about disability ministry, and the workshop I was in, he said, a disability ministry will have a hard time happening if the senior pastor or someone up there doesn't get it. And it will always probably be small in number. It won't be the cost-effective, these people are not going to be the ones that are going to drop the most money into the offering plate. And you need to understand that people with disabilities, it's not going to go away. So if you're going to start a ministry, think of it in terms of long-term, because a lot of these families have tried and it hasn't worked, or they've been disappointed, so then they quit coming. So you've maybe done more harm than good if you say, we've got something for you, and then you really don't, because it's going to, usually a disability is a lifelong thing, and it's all stages from infancy. When you get older, you might become disabled or whatever, the dementia, whatever. So it's a wide spectrum, and you're in it for the long haul.
And I just wanted to add that if you think about it, we all, and one issue we could discuss is that we all have equal opportunities to become part of this minority group. Most of us are just a fall away from becoming part of this minority group, and so I think when you begin to express it that way, it may have a greater impact as well. To think that, you know, you today you can have a family with no one with a disability, and your family can be in a car accident tonight, and tomorrow you can now be in that minority group, that marginalized group that was spoken about.
And I think this is where I think, speaking globally, Denise's point is a very important one. Anytime we're taking seriously people that society doesn't take seriously, we're pushing back against a huge wave of categorizations, right? So that's part of the reason I gave you that story from the first couple of centuries of Christianity, because you know, it didn't take one sermon for Christians to begin to take lepers seriously. But then, you know, it took a lot of sermons and a lot of examples and a lot of thumping on the chests of pastors and a lot of, you know, trying to press people at the coalface. And so these are, you know, there's a lot of force in our society as a whole training us to think differently about what's going on. And that's why it's so important that here in the church we are the catalyst to again think through, in practice, a whole range of separations between people that are endemic to our society. So that's part of the reason I took us back to the beginning, because we need to recognize that disability ministry is not just let's like include another subgroup in our ministry program. It challenges the way we live our lives and the binaries that organize our existence all the time, and we don't even realize how they organize our existence until we have somebody with us who normally our lives are much easier by not having them involved.
Public school setting. What advice would you give to teachers who have a special needs student in their class? Are there some practical steps that would be helpful in the time and under the constraints that they're working?
Well, now with RTI and the public school system response to intervention, I think
Sorry, could you explain what is
response to intervention is where we don't place kids immediately into special education solely because the teacher thinks there's a deficit. That referral is delayed. So it's a 3-tier process by which the first tier, all the students receive the same instruction. The second tier is the students who did not master the tasks in tier 1, they go to tier 2. And then tier 3 are the fewer students. So if you can envision a pyramid, it's tier 1, 2, and 3. And so 3 is the most intensive with the fewer students who have not mastered that task, whatever that task might be. And so from with RTI, then at the different stages, students are kept in more inclusive settings longer before that is made. However, the issue that I have as a professional is the subjectivity of teachers. And so as I've talked a lot about today in terms of being reflective, is to really begin to be subjective. Be mindful of your subjectivity. And I personally believe that it is because of our subjectivity that we have children in special education who don't belong in special education. And so for teachers, I would just encourage you to be mindful about how you see difference. And is difference truly a deficit? Or is it something that you're, as a teacher, you're just not comfortable with, or you don't know how to handle? And so I think that would be the piece of advice that I would give teachers, because teachers are on the front line, and they are responsible for saying, yes, I see weaknesses here, I see learning issues here, I see speech delays here. And it's from their interpretation of these students that they either get help, or they're in the 3-tier RTI system, or they're in special education, which in most school settings, it's a more segregated setting. And then that's a whole nother issue when we talk about children in special education who are in segregated settings in desegregated schools. And so we could talk another hour just on that, but that would be my advice to teachers.
I'll just give you from a view of my daughter. When she was born in 75, she was in a program at 3, all special needs kids. Then mainstreaming was becoming the word. Inclusion wasn't ever around then. But when she was 7, she had all the skills that a kindergartner would need. And so we asked, could she be in the kindergarten class? However, they didn't do back then, okay, well then you have to sign her out of special ed. All those services are no longer available to her, speech therapy or whatever. If that's what you want, she goes to the neighborhood school. So there was no on the front end of let's do an awareness. And I have found awareness to the other kids in the class is huge. And that first day of school, it happened that the class was way bigger, so they had a new kindergarten class. They brought the 3rd grade teacher down who'd never taught kindergarten. So here she's going to have kindergarten plus a child with Down syndrome in her class, not prepared. I will never forget picking my daughter up and the other moms standing out there waiting for their kids and saying, did you hear there's a mongoloid boy in this class? And I had to say, actually, the term would be Down syndrome, and explained why. And she's my daughter, and she's never been in a class with any speech modeling. I just wanted to see what happened. I know she has Down syndrome, it's okay. It was not a good experience, and all of her social skills that had been pretty good up till that point started. She was doing things like pulling chairs out from under people, staying on top of the jungle gym. She was crying out, I don't want to be here. Then we found a teacher in a different school district that was looking for a student with a disability because she felt, and she had an alternative class from kindergarten through 3rd grade was her model, and so every child went at their own speed. So she had individual math, everything for each child. She was looking for a child with Down syndrome to come into that classroom to help the other kids learn differences. That was probably the best school experience those 3 years my daughter was in there, where she then, she was invited to birthday parties. The parents, all that worked in the classroom, because parents had to have participation, they were thanking us for teaching their children. It was incredible. When she got bigger and we knew that she needed to be more specialized and more of a special day class, and we took her out of there, for some reason they let me sit in with her testing at that time. And so we sat in there, and I remember the psychologist, how does she know that bears hibernate and it can be water, steam, and because she sat in that classroom with that teacher and she absorbed what she got. And then we were back in special day classes, so it was always whatever works best. But I think the teacher is huge in their attitude to the other kids for them to see. And this teacher had expectations, and she thought she can do it at her level, and it was an incredible experience. Back before inclusion was a word.
And I just wanted to add as well, in terms of as teacher, is to be open to collaborate with special educators, your school psychologists, and anyone who has credentials to work with children with disabilities, is to really be open and receptive, and not have the attitude, well, I didn't go to school, or I've heard this before, I didn't go to school to work with these children. And with the inclusion movement, you will have students with disabilities in your class. And not only that, you'll just with the variance of learning styles, you'll have variance in your classrooms.
Steph, any particularly brilliant teaching moments that, or teacher moments that Adam has been a recipient of that you'd like to commend?
Well, I think, I mean, Adam's needs are, he's lower on the functioning level, so his needs are a little bit less the reading, writing kind of learning, and we found that out. He was at there were 3 special needs schools in Aberdeen, and one of them, the one he was at, combined with the mainstream school. And so he was going there, and they were really being pressured to teach. But this wasn't Adam's fit, and I had long meetings with the teachers about how to fit Adam in there, and it just wasn't going to happen. And he came home one day and said, "Bad boy." And for somebody who hardly ever speaks to say "bad boy," we whisked him out immediately and put him in a different school. But I think there the primary focus is on communication. Communication is the exchange of, for Adam to be able to learn and absorb and to then give back as well and use that. So they've worked a lot on, like as I said, communication tools and ways to meet him in his way of communication, which is largely sign. So we do something called Macathon with him, and teach people that they want to know. And I've organized Macathon sessions for churches, that kind of thing. But I think just bringing it to a concrete level that Adam can do. He loved to throw things for a while, which is obviously problematic. But people would then, both in the church setting and school, would make that into a kind of learning game, and using soft balls or soft bean bags and coloring them and teaching him colors while he's throwing, and working with where he's at and what he likes to do. I think we're all a bit like that, aren't we?
And when you say working where he's at, I think that's an important thing that we found. We have a Bible instruction class here when you're in 8th grade, and you have to get this, memorize all the scripture and do all these things. And we've had some students that want to go through it, but if they can just get one little concept out of the verse, they need to be moved on. They can, and I think that's really important, that we don't be so rigid over what has to happen for certain recognition in church, that they can be who they are, the way they see God.
Well, many more questions that we could go to. Maybe you'll be around for perhaps a few minutes afterwards if we didn't get some of your questions answered. But please join me in thanking our panel.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.